Big showdown in the Pac-12. We've got Utah visiting Autzen Stadium to take on the Ducks. Kind of a semifinal type matchup, possibly, as we work out the various scenarios in the Pac-12 with USC and UCLA also hooking up at the Rose Bowl. We got Eric Scopel on the line from Deck Territory on 247 Sports to help us break it all down. Eric, appreciate you being here.
Yeah, no problem. Hopefully this week's game goes a little better for the Ducks than the last one.
Yeah, let's talk about that last game. Much is made of Dan Lanning's decision later in the game. Of course, game on the line to go for it on fourth down. Bo Nix had left the game earlier. Apparently, some had said that he was prepared to come back into the game, which of course he did on the final drive. So how do you interpret the way all that came down and what Dan Lanning had to say?
Yeah. My issue was not with going for it on fourth down as much as it was not using a timeout to maybe get Bo back in the game or to make a change in the play call. What they ended up running against the defense that was in place for Washington was pretty clear, especially when you rewatch the play. Basically dead on arrival. It was not going to work. The running back slipped, but there was very, very slim percent chance that actually works out. So I didn't have as much of an issue with the play with going for it as much as I did with the decision that was made once you decided you're going for it in terms of the play call and the person on the field. If Bo was available to play on that play, I'm guessing Bo might have checked out of the decision that Ty Thompson made in terms of which play call to run. So I think that part plays a role as well. But I think for me, I had less of an issue with deciding to go for it because, to be honest, Oregon's defense hadn't stopped Washington really at all with any consistency in that game. And there's also a pretty big question in the kicking game. Oregon has rotated through 4 different punters this season. I don't even know who would be out there in that situation. With the game on the line, I don't think there's any guarantee that punt really flips the field that much either. So you could have been dealing with a situation where, you're giving Washington, I should say, the ball back with, quite a bit of time and certainly enough time to go down and take a lead without having to really drive that far. So obviously failing to get it is the worst possible outcome, but the possibility of going for it, getting it, extending the drive, getting Bo Nix possibly back in the game and maybe going down and winning the game, to me would outrule kind of the ultimate decision to go for it. To make some more sense to me than punting would have.
Yeah, back to the defense. You mentioned the Oregon defense and the lack of effectiveness in this game. You look at the individual talent on this defense: Justin Flo, Bennett Williams, Noah Sewell, of course, and a whole slew of other guys. It would seem to add up to what should be a more effective defense that has shown at times that it can be dominant. It's very athletic, but in this particular game, just couldn't find the answers for Michael Penix.
Yeah, and I think a lot of things are at play here. I think the speed in Oregon secondary has not been good and won't be any better, obviously, with the current players in place anytime this season. You don't simply improve a speed deficiency during a season. You might be able to do that in professional sports, and maybe in college football pretty soon you'll be able to have an in-season transfer portal or something to go add players. But I mean, who knows? But right now, Oregon is basically playing with a lack of speed, I think, on the back end, and playing against a team like Washington that has a lot of it and that is also very adept conceptually to taking advantage, I should say, of some of those weaknesses. It was kind of the worst possible matchup for an Oregon defense that has been, I would say, pretty consistently bad in certain circumstances, but better than they were on Saturday most weekends. And I think the thing that was frustrating to a certain degree was it wasn't like it was your inexperienced players making mistakes or getting beaten. Bennett Williams, who you mentioned a moment ago, one of the team's most talented defensive players, typically a box safety was playing was in coverage a lot and got beat twice for long touchdowns. This is 3 now he's been beaten for in 2 weeks over 60 yards. And they played a lot of zone, I think, with the idea that you could hopefully keep everything in front of you and extend drives and then, win some red zone situations with sound defense. But you get beat on a couple of those by Williams, who's a step slow here, a step slow there. or really just fantastic throws too by Penix. You have to give him a lot of credit, especially the second one. I thought was just an outstanding ball that kind of just beat any coverage, almost regardless of who's there. But the point remains, Oregon has a lot of issues to sort out in its secondary and in its defense as a whole. And I think Washington did a fantastic job of kind of making the most of the matchups that they had that were favorable.
Okay, Bo Nix did finish the game. However, just what do we know at this point in regards to his availability?
It's really hard to know or say much here, Mark. I'll be honest. Usually we go to practice and have kind of free reign to write what we see from an injury perspective. We were told not to do that this week. It's not just Bo Nix who's dealing with some stuff. A couple of the team's starting offensive linemen, starting center Alex Forsyth and right guard Ryan Walk, also injured in the Washington game. Neither returned in that game. It's worth noting. And so I don't feel comfortable sharing what I saw at practice. What was interesting was Dan has said a couple of things, and then also one of the players has said some things. And Chris Hudson, in particular, a sophomore wide receiver, came out and kind of indicated that that Ty Thompson would be starting this weekend. I don't know how much you want to read into that in terms of this is kind of a person who hasn't had a lot of time in front of the camera, either sharing some information he shouldn't have, or maybe just trying to support another teammate of his who hasn't played very much and speaking in terms that sounded definitive when maybe they aren't.
Hmm.
But regardless, Chris Hudson said some things on Wednesday that certainly made its way to social media, as you would expect, and also made its way to Las Vegas, where the line has shifted 5 points in a matter of hours afterwards. So I don't think there's really any clarity from my perspective of who will be at quarterback. Dan Lanning said on Monday that he got some encouraging or I think he said positive news regarding some of these injuries to Nix and the offensive lineman. And then on Wednesday at his coach's show, which is an in-house radio program, said that Nix had been preparing this week as if he would play. So kind of getting mixed signals from a couple of different people who are speaking publicly. So it's hard to know, and I think the shift in Vegas maybe indicates that some aren't anticipating Nix to play. But I will say, like from my perspective, this is a guy who's really tough. Came back and played after taking a huge shot in that Washington game, and I'm sure he'll do whatever he can to be out there for what is senior day and could be his last opportunity to play at Autzen Stadium, depending on the decision he makes, which I think most anticipate will be to go pro or to finish at least his college eligibility this year. But regardless, I think he's going to try to play as best he can, but we'll see what happens on Saturday. I think we're really going to be one of those things where you're waiting until right around kickoff to really get a feel for what's going to happen.
Got Eric Scopel on the line from Duck Territory 247 Sports as the Ducks prepare for their game against Utah. Key Pac-12 game, of course, as both teams eye a spot in the Pac-12 championship game. And of course, this is the game that was played for the Pac-12 championship last year. They're very different teams, especially on the Oregon side. Two of the main players in this mix. On the Utah side, of course, quarterback Cam Rising is back, and so is their leading rusher Tavion Thomas, although he's not had quite the year that he had last year, still their number one running back. And of course, the coaching situation has been as stable as possible anywhere in the country at Utah. But of course, Oregon, a whole new situation from a coaching standpoint and quarterback standpoint. However, a ton of players back from that team that dropped two straight to Utah in resounding fashion. So I don't know if they made any reference to those games and how much this one means.
Yeah, no, and I think a couple of things are at play. Obviously, coming off a loss to Washington, there is a ton of motivation now because you're playing in part for how your season's going to be remembered. And I've made this point a couple of times this week of this is now 2 times in the last 3 seasons where Oregon has been in position to maybe make a college football playoff, dropped a game in November. In 2019, they lost to Arizona State. In 2021, obviously, as you referenced, they lost to Utah and Salt Lake City. Both times they had opportunities to kind of rebound and turn their seasons around. In 19, they did that. They ended up beating Utah in the conference championship, went and beat Wisconsin in the Rose Bowl. Justin Herbert gets to kind of ride off into the sunset along with a really talented and one of probably the more, I would say, meaningful senior classes in the program, at least recent history. And then in 2021, it kind of snowballed. They beat Oregon State, but then they got clobbered by Utah the second time. They went and played in the Alamo Bowl. That was an ugly loss to Oklahoma. And you look back at that season and go, man, there were some really big highs beating Ohio State and Columbus, but the totality of the season is probably considered by most a disappointment. And so you have this season now where losing to Utah in a vacuum, I don't think would be looked at as a huge disappointment in terms of what that Utah program is. Obviously, Oregon fans and the Oregon program and players, and as you asked, have said already that this game is one that they were eyeing pretty closely going into the season, given what happened last year. A couple of players have said that last year's loss still kind of hurts, and they're trying to go out and make amends with that by getting a victory. But when you add the loss to Washington and you add the fact that if you lose this game, you don't even play for a conference championship, which is something the last three teams all have done at Oregon, and you would go from being a team that was playing for a college football playoff spot to not even being in the conference championship game for the first time in almost half a decade. I think that there's a pretty good understanding among the players of everything that's at stake, and it's a lot at stake this weekend. It was always going to be when the schedule came out. To me, I looked at this and thought this is the game of the year in conference play without question in the conference, and certainly for Oregon and Utah. USC and UCLA have both played well, and kind of that matchup this weekend is also really significant. Basically, the winners of those two games will likely meet in the conference championship. But with the way the season has played out, I think it's become quite clear that this is a huge game for Oregon, and an opportunity to right a wrong here and avoid losing consecutive home games at Autzen Stadium for what will be the first time since 2016.
Eric Skopel, Duck Territory on 247 Sports, breaking down Oregon and Utah for us. Eric, anything else there?
No, I think, just I thought I've been thinking of, and I think I know I said on our podcast, is that for the defense here, if you go out and you have some success against, again, a Utah offense that is very, huge variance in what Utah does and what Washington does. Washington spreads you out. They're going to be four wide out a lot of the time, and they're going to throw the football 45, 50 times a game. You got beat by that type of an offense. Okay, maybe you can chalk that up to that's just a bad matchup. But if you go out and you play a Utah team, which is much larger personnel packages, wants to run the ball 40 plus times a game, and you get thumped again in pretty resounding fashion. I know the game last week was close, but they gave up a ton of yardage. They gave up 37 points. If something similar happens this week, and I know there's already a lot of people that are very critical of this defense, I think that would validate some of those concerns even more of going, hey, it wasn't just a really bad matchup with Washington that was the issue. It was also, there's some issues, I don't know, structurally, some talent issues, some schematic issues, maybe some coaching issues that need to be worked out. And that would be pretty alarming. I'm not saying, again, in a vacuum, struggling against Utah isn't concerning necessarily. It's obviously not ideal because it's become kind of a rivalry game. But if you have basically consecutive weeks against very, very different offenses and you have the same results, I think that would be something that would stick out pretty hard pretty hard for this fan base to accept, considering, again, what the expectation was when Dan Lanning was brought in here, and with some of the at least recruiting ranking talent that is on this team.
Good stuff as always from Eric Skopel, Duck Territory 247 Sports. It should be a good one. It's an important one for sure. Eric, we appreciate you stopping by.
Okay, no problem, Mark. Have a good one.